I literally wanted to gather you in this vacant warehouse to have
I think it's a very appropriate place, I have to tell you.
It's interesting. Do you think it has echoes of our future in the church?
I think it, yes, it just might. It just might. This is the kind of space where one feels most comfortable, right?
Yeah.
Is that not true?
Yeah.
Don't you feel more comfortable here than in somebody's overstuffed living room?
Me too.
I do, and I think that's a real shift. I think that speaks to the emergent sensibilities.
Why is that?
I'm not quite sure why, but there's something about an overstuffed sofa that says somebody made a real commitment to this thing, to this object.
Yeah, or a pew.
Yeah, any of those things. And here, I mean, this can be gone in 5 seconds, right?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I once heard someone say that pews tell lies about who Jesus is.
They do. The Reformation gave us pews, and, you know, that's one of the problems. It's one of the things. Reformation came along and said, it's the word, it's the head, right? It's logic. You know, the old joke that the Reformation took Christianity north doesn't mean Geneva in Scotland. It means here on your body, you know. And when that happened, you have to screw the believer down to the floor so he can or she can watch the person in a box proclaim what God thinks. Yeah. How annoying is that?
Well, I think when I think of this space, I think of the potential.
Okay.
I think of what we can put in it.
Of course you would. Of course. What I can fill it up with.
You know, there's so little that we need to take out and what we can put in. So it's the potential of it. But yeah, we've certainly moved forward, I think, in Ireland over the last period of time. There's huge debates around things like pews and all the various items within church. But I guess, like this empty space, there's huge potential and desire to want to be filled with something new. There's a great spirituality in our heritage.
Also, the barrier between the urban and the rural is lessened in a space like this. Because, I mean, we're so urbanized that we miss the rural. And you come into a space like this where the windows are obviously commercial in size and the outside is there. I think that's part of the cup.
And I mean, when I see this space, I mean, I like it because it's kind of, it's scarred almost.
I like the scarred part.
Yeah, it's broken, and I think that anybody who walks in here can actually, like I said, there's a sense of ease almost in the place. Now, in saying that, you have lots of other people who might come in here and find it dirty or uncomfortable or cold, and I think that's the trick, isn't it, with doing church, is trying to find a way of being both.
Yeah.
What is the both end of that? I mean,
well, I think it ties into what you were saying about the pews. You know, taking the pews out just isn't going to do it.
No,
you know?
not alone.
I think there's an
but
awful lot
helps.
more. It certainly does help. It does help. But many churches just taken out pews and done the same thing every Sunday. So there's more of a need to do that. But I think it's the desire. I think for me, that's what I keep coming back to: the hunger and the desire for wanting more in that. And from the Irish point of view, your original
because you'd rather a church full of pews that is actually actively involved in the community than a church that has no pews and are just there for themselves.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't. I mean, there's not like they have pews, thus they're not involved with their community. That's not. There's no flat out answer, is there?
No, there's not. It's go in.
It's not that simple.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. There may not be 100% flat out answer, but I'd level 90% of an answer.
Okay.
Because it's, or at least in North America where I work more often, you can go into a church and they will ask you to come in and see if they are suitable for an alt worship or for an emergence community or something, and you meet with their council or their vestry or whatever. And I've learned for 5 minutes going in, you make nice, and then you ask the question, can you unscrew the pews? And if the answer is no, you make nice for 5 minutes and leave. If the answer is yes, you're going to be there for 2 or 3 hours.
Is that right?
Because it's symptomatic. It's not the pews.
Yeah.
It's they're symptomatic. They're kind of a litmus test for how institutionalized we really are and how much we're tied to the things in this space as opposed to using this space for something more dynamic and fluid. So it's not the pews per se. It's that they're symptomatic. You know, if you've got a fever of 103, you're probably sick. It doesn't diagnose your illness, but you've got something.
I mean, there's a comedian called Bill Hicks who died, I don't know, 20 years ago or whatever. I don't know if you've ever come across him. I think sometimes the comedians are the prophets of our time.
Of course they are.
They're the artists. They're able to say things and push things further.
Outrageous.
Yeah, and he said this, and I like it. He said, and I don't myself assign to this fully. I just think it's an interesting... he said, a country full of ancient religions that no longer serve their function on this planet because they are based on fear instead of love. And I think maybe control is something I throw in there as well. I'm wondering, like, what do? We have a great church. We have a great sense of tradition, especially in this nation. We have some great churches that are working hard at actually seeing a community and a country change. But yet there's still that kind of feeling of control that surrounds us. I mean, how do we find freedom in the midst of that control? What'd you say?
Well, first of all, I think we need to be just careful in throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Oh, that's why I said traditions are doing great things.
Yeah,
I'm nothing against it at all.
Yeah, totally. So I guess coming from a background, an Anglo-Catholic background myself, there's an appreciation of tradition and the importance of liturgy and all those aspects.
Absolutely.
But I do think that it's trying to see. I have this saying, it comes from somewhere: life can only be understood backwards, but must be lived forwards. And I guess
it's absolutely true. That's what I was trying to say. Yes.
And it comes into that whole concept that in order to swing further forward, you need to swing further backwards and to get a higher kick and to enjoy it.
But with the fear and control, I think there's certainly an element of that.
Yeah.
But there's a need and a desire, more importantly, the desire to want to get past that fear.
Sure.
Not just in the people within the church or the people outside the church, but also in the structures and the hierarchy of the church.
Oh, sure, of course.
And that's very pertinent. So I think there's a desire to want to go way, way back, maybe, I don't know, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th century, something
absolutely.
like that, and come forward and bring the goodness of that.
That's right.
And how does one do that?
Well, Robert Webber, as you were talking, I think, the first thing I thought of when you started talking is I met a bishop the other day who said that there are many people in his diocese who would rather save their traditions than their children. And I think that's the flip side of the tradition thing. But Robert Webber, in late 60s, spoke of the ancient future. He coined that, the ancient future, and wrote a book called Evangelicals on the Canterbury Trail. The only error being, of course, that he thought it was evangelicals. He didn't perceive that it was more than evangelicals. So now it would be emergence Christians on the Canterbury Trail, which is, and he said, the best I can tell, we're rapidly hastening toward the 3rd century. And he's absolutely right. Nobody, I think, wants to throw out the baby, even in emergence or in institutional church. Those gifts, and it fascinates me to watch Anglicanism become more and more important in emergence communities wherever they are, because it's in Anglicanism that you get the almost pure transmission, if you will. Protestantism has changed liturgy and gotten rid of liturgy in many ways, though if 2 or 3 people are doing the same thing twice, it's a liturgy when you get right down to it. But historic liturgy.
Tradition has a way of always filling a void.
And Roman Catholicism is seen as very hierarchical. So that leaves the Anglican tradition as a way of getting back to those early. But no, we must not throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I don't even think anybody wants to.
No,
I think they'd like to update it.
Yeah, I think what I would say is within the church, I definitely think that there's that passion to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. I guess where I'm coming from very fervent secularists, or people within societies like religion is dead. The famous Marxist saying religion is the opium of the people. We know that's only half of what he said.
That's right.
But there's this huge pressure to want to just throw it all out. And I think we have to, in some way, get through the fear and control thing, but look for the goodness and the beauty.
I wonder if that's more true in Ireland than some other parts, because the cachet of the outre, for that, we call them the de-churched and the unchurched and the non-churched, using the terminology of the mission-shaped church out of the UK, which has pretty much pervaded our conversation. And the appeal, the incense, the appeal of the chocolate with the Eucharist, the appeal of all that stuff in a fully secularized world that has a certain cachet. And that's really cool. I didn't grow up with that, so I don't have any unpleasant memories of it. They say, I don't remember that somebody in one of those robes smacked me once, or I don't remember that I was bored to death while they lit all those candles, any of that kind of thing. Instead, there's this mystery. So I think emergence, while we don't usually assign it as a characteristic, more and more I'm inclined to deeply narrative. There's no question that it's narrative, but I think there's also a strong element of mysticism, which is expressed in that hunger for the liturgy.
Do you know, last year when we first met you, Rob and I were there in Chicago. We had an opportunity to spend some time with Brian McLaren, and sitting on the floor of the Chicago Opera House is quite an interesting moment.
Yeah, it would be.
He actually said this, and it kind of is, I don't know, it's really resonated and echoed with me for like the last year, and we talked a bit about this, haven't we, Rob? But he said, aim for truth, and you'll get legalism. Aim for beauty, and you'll find truth and inclusion.
Yes.
And I don't know if I really got that, actually, until I came back to Ireland and started living amongst a culture, a church that I love, that is aiming constantly for truth, but we're missing out on inclusion at times. And I'm wondering, how do we aim for beauty and inclusion and not lose out on truth? It's a question.
Well, it's a very good question. It is a very good question. No, I so entirely agree with Brian, though I probably could not have said it nearly so well, that the pursuit of beauty is important. However, let me say that in Judaism, especially in emergence Judaism, there is a beginning of what's called the understanding of the Keatsian heresy,
okay.
Which is that beauty and truth are not necessarily the same.
Mm-hmm.
And the argument, to put it facetiously, is that the hero of Paradise Lost is not God, it's the devil, you know, kind of thing. So that beauty cannot, it's so enculturated that it cannot be trusted unless you speak very carefully of eternal beauty and separate the eternal beauty from that which is aesthetically beautiful to the fallen animal or to the fallen creature or whatever you want to call us. So there's a danger. Having said that, because I started my life wanting to become a poet, I'm still for the Keatsian heresy. You know, I think that much of the worship experience, much of the spiritual experience is beauty.
Because I find truth most often in beauty.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all do.
And maybe, I mean, what about you, Rob? I mean,
well, I think when I heard him say that in Chicago, I was reminded of the story of Christ when Mary came in and
with the spiker.
And she, like many of the Pharisees and many of the characters in the Gospels, they went to Christ looking for truth. She came in broken, and she did this amazing act of washing the feet, and wanted Jesus that she has done a beautiful thing. And she learned truth in that act of interaction with Jesus. And I think
that's very well said.
For me is like the understanding of beauty and truth. It's like that symbiotic relationship that exists. Well, I do think they are different, but for me, it helps.
They're handmaidens, each to the other, in many ways. Yeah, and the making of beauty is also the participatory part of making of beauty is a big part of worship, as opposed to just watching it be performed.
Absolutely.
And I think emergence would immediately make that difference between participatory and performance. When they speak of being incarnational, they don't necessarily mean Jesus coming or the Word coming into flesh, but the ability to incarnate the worship, to feel it, to pot in the middle of a sermon, or to paint, and the difference between having music that you can do this with, as opposed to just sitting there and listening to it. So I think it's participatory beauty is better.
Go a bit deeper than that. It's something that really fascinates me. I think it was N.T. Wright or someone of that genre was talking about this idea of beauty in the Eucharist.
Yeah, it was right.
They were talking about, you know, the epiclesis, when you pronounce the blessing on the hosts. He was saying it's more important to pronounce that epiclesis on the people. You know, on the beauty of God on the people, as opposed to getting wrapped up in the theology. And I think that idea of the participatory worship is something that empowerment of the people.
Absolutely.
Is that what?
Yes, absolutely.
That's really amazing.
Yes, absolutely.
It's nice. And is that kind of tying back a little bit towards you were talking about the Orthodox thing earlier? Is that tying a little bit back into that?
Well, when I was hearing Phyllis talk about mysticism, it's something that I in my own faith need to get more in touch with my Orthodox heritage, because there's something between mysticism and beauty that I don't get, but it gives me freedom to relate to God, the numinous, in a way, through an Orthodox understanding.
Absolutely. And the borrowing, while it seems to me that the majority of borrowing by emergence is from Anglicanism. Or Brian McLaurin, he called me one day and said, when are you going to see what you're looking at, and when are you going to look at what you're seeing? And I said, and he said, because you're Anglican, you're pulling your punch.
Wrong number.
And I laughed and said, okay, you just empowered me to say that indeed Anglicanism is the one being borrowed from most. But I think that's only because in Western tradition, Orthodox has been a little outre or not culturally so present. And as the world globalizes and as emergence grows, it's beginning to borrow more and more from Eastern Orthodoxy and Greek. It's going to be really interesting to see. And some borrowing.
I think I look good with a beard.
Oh, the beards are
Yeah,
wonderful.
absolutely.
A married clergy, all of those good, you know, and a chocolate at the Eucharist. I mean, I'm right there. I'm on it, you know. But even the icons, which is what you're really talking about.
Yeah.
Not an iconostasis, but the icons around all of the worship space, where almost everywhere you go, even if it's a very small node that's meeting, there'll be an icon there, and some of and the music, and even some borrowing from the Syriac tradition. The St. Gregory of Nyssa in San Francisco in the States is a beautiful example of what happens when you merge emergent sensibilities with a kind of Syriac or Coptic.
Quite often, I go every year to just, you know, look for God, and He's always there looking for me.
Yeah, it's amazing. He's always there.
Yeah, He's never gone. But I always take along what they call penal cross, which is like a small little one they used to slip up their sleeve robes in Ireland during a lot of
during the famine.
The famine,
like that.
Yeah.
Disestablishment.
And a lot of my friends would be shocked to find I take a crucifix when I go to pray. And because it seems like such a Catholic thing or such a whatever thing, but for me, iPad, crucifix, it's all empty building, building full of pews. For me, it's all about, you know, giving me textures and tensions to find God in the midst of it. I love that kind of thing. Now, one of the things we
makes you a good emergence Christian, by the way. Hallmark.
Is there a link here, though? Because with the icons, is there a link between the lack of desire to want to remove pews in a Protestant setting, and also a lack of engagement with icons? Because if we remove pews and if we engage in icons, we're actually becoming more Catholic than the Reformation made us.
Or,
this is
I would say, yes, certainly to some extent more Catholic, but I think the greater emphasis would be becoming more mystical than either Rome or Wittenberg allowed us to be, because you're moving out into freedom.
Yes.
You know, into greater and greater freedom. And when you do that, when you move to greater freedom, you move into the interior increasingly, and you begin to speak in no language, or to not articulate in language. And Protestantism has to have language. You can't save your soul unless you can talk, kind of thing. And Orthodoxy does not, and Syriac both. They speak without language, both certainly in music and in symbol, but also in non-articulatable ways. And because of the heavy Pentecostal element in emergence Christianity, that's more comfortable for emergence groups usually. If you don't have to articulate too much of it, if you can feel and experience it, and then you bring the experience out and articulate it, or you bring the experience out and you live it, you live by it, but you don't have to, you don't have to say it in the way you do in Protestantism and Roman also.
I'm just wondering, in my mind, is like embracing the experiential and the imagination, the antidote for the amount of control that's been in
I
the
think
church.
so.
You know what I mean? Like just allowing that, opening the imagination. You know, it's kind of, don't use your mind. Imagination is, but be more experiential.
I think that's characteristic of it. Everywhere I see emergence, that's one of the characteristics of it. I think that's why it likes narrative. You know, don't be propositional. The first rule is don't come in here and be propositional. I don't want your propositions. Tell me the story. You know, and then maybe I'll, like going between Scylla and Charybdis, I'll make my way to the sea.
Help me out there, Scylla and... I'm wondering
what
we're talking about.
Scylla and Charybdis at the Hellespont, the 2 points that
come back
between the Mediterranean and the Sea of Azov as you go up to the Baltic Sea. Scylla and Charybdis, they were seen by the ancients. See, my Latin and Greek undergraduate is showing, I'm sorry, but they were seen as monsters. And they were, you had to be able to, one was here and one was here, and you had to be able to negotiate very carefully, or one of the monsters would grab you or the other one would grab you, and they ancients animated them. So
and tie that back into what you were just saying.
Well, to negotiate into the Sea of Truth or the Sea of Azov, to negotiate from the big water into the particular and serene water, you have to be able to. You can't go straight ahead.
And who would you?
Paradox is what. Paradox is the answer. you know, Pete Rollins' book, How Not to Speak of God, or the fact that paradox holds the truth far more than Christianity is best understood paradoxically.
I think that a lot of times we hear emergence, we hear these conversations. You know, how would you define this, Phyllis?
Well, emergence is G-E-N-C-E. Emergence Christianity is an overarching concept. In the same way that Protestantism is an overarching concept. It names sensibility. It groups together disparate groups on the basis that they have certain common sensibilities. Just like you've got Protestants who are Presbyterian, Protestants who are Methodist, Protestants who are, you know, they're Protestant because they share this, they're Methodist as opposed to Lutheran because they differ here. Emergence Christianity, and it didn't really used to, it's a phenomenon since about 2009 or 10, but I think it matters enormously. I'd love to hear you speak to the fact that emergence Christianity now needs to be recognized. If you're going to talk about the phenomenon, you need to talk about emergence Christianity, because one of the divisions of it is emerging, and it's not the whole, and emergent, ENT is another one. This is more to name the conversation. You call emergence Christianity. To name the particular pods within the conversation, it's emerging or emergent or deep church or alt worship church or cyber church.
All spheres to be involved in emergence.
But if you conflate the overarching thing with emerging, or the overarching thing with emergent, you have conflated the whole, the larger thing, into the small one. Plus which, you have made emerging and emergent interchangeable words, and believe me, they are not.
What is your fear about that whole?
Well, I think for me, just hearing Phyllis saying that is just so useful, because in Ireland, in my context, it was just taking one of the segments of the orange, and that was the whole orange.
The whole orange, and it's not.
It's not the whole orange. And so for me, just reading the book that Phyllis wrote, The Great Emergence, is that understanding of that, actually this is a huge paradigm shift. It's huge. More than just religion. Everything's changing, everything's shifting.
Society,
so
everything.
Whether it's a discussion from a church in New York like Redeemer, or from our context, it's an awareness of change, shift, and that we need to get on board, we need to get on the bus, and it's not just a dilution, it's just a massive change.
That's right. I very often say to audiences, if you are 40 or under, your emergence, because you're a citizen of the Great Emergence, you can't help it anymore, you can change the color of your eyes. And to think pastorally or any other way, or as church folk, that we're going to be able to speak to the under 40 within the mindset and the worldview of modernity is just insane. It ain't gonna happen. You can't go backward. The shift has been too dramatic in everything. And so 40 and under is going to be emergence. Whether they are emergence Christians or not is not the point. But they're going to be citizens of the Great Emergence.
You were saying that emergence is not just being used either in context of churches or traditions. It's also being used in science. It's being used.
It comes up out of science. We slap the label on this thing straight up out of the biology lab. The thing that I could, if I were God and could undo history, is that it was a emergence and a sign of emergence theory among sociologists and biologists, right on up until we get in my fellow countrymen, folk like Doug Paget and Tony Jones, who freely admit that as they began to work with what was happening in the late 80s, early 90s, they sat down together and deliberately said, now what shall we call ourselves? As innocent of what was going on, what shall we call ourselves? I listened to Doug tell this tale again the other day, and I was ready to smack him. And he says, so we sat around and we concluded that there's anti-emergence sold, in feed stores so that you can put weeds down and prevent their emerging, and they're emerging forests, and we speak of the emergence of that. What we are, says he, great revelation. What we are is we are coming up, we're new growth in an old forest, and therefore we must be emerging growth. And they named it emerging, and we got emergent village out of that and all of that, and it spread like a great cancer, rhetorical cancer, confusing the the idea of emergence as a known principle in biology.
But you would lift
with
up,
this action thing, you know.
You would list out like the Reformation, and you would break down history in saying that we're now in the Great Emergence.
Oh, yeah, we're in the Great Emergence. And in all honesty, it's had some other names. There have been some other attempts, you know, the Great Convergence for a while looked like what it was going to be. Or the fourth, Richard Florida, the Great Reset. I just think he's a hoot, but he just, big hunk of tongue and cheek, just screw it all, you know, just the Great Reset. The Fourth Awakening, the Fourth Turning, and some of them the Fifth Turning. But it's all recognition that every 500 years we go whoopee.
And you know, I heard someone recently say that the light has gone out in Europe.
Yes.
You know, and I actually approached the person afterwards and said, I totally disagree with you. I don't think the light's gone out in Europe. As a matter of fact, I live in Europe and I see a lot of light.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. And,
of course.
But I mean, what would you say to that? I mean, as a pastor, you know, a rector, as, you know, a historian and a scholar, I mean, what would you say to that?
Well, I think you've got to look at what definition, what do you mean by the light? I think
exactly.
Jesus is the light of the world, and he never goes out. But I think it depends how you view success. You know, how you define church growth. Like if you define it by big mega churches that are booming and bustling, maybe the light is still on. But I think we're more in a shifting, a turning point where Jesus is the light and we're embracing that and moving in this great emergence.
Exactly.
So I just wouldn't be so arrogant to say the light has gone out, because in my context, working in a traditional setting in this great emergence, the light certainly is not out.
I totally agree.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I wouldn't agree with that essentially to say, but...
But I mean, I don't know what the context was of it, but I think it's just because that, you know, everything, it's not as shiny any longer. The European traditions, they don't look so glossy. There's been a lot of tragic things that have happened amongst our traditions, you know, in a lot of them. And so it also doesn't have that real shine to it that maybe the big mega churches around the world do. I think it might be seen a little bit like
shine.
It's
an unfortunate shine.
Yeah, it's a shine that comes from a polluted,
but
you know, a good sunset's better when there's pollution involved.
Yeah, I know exactly.
A lot about this.
Definitely better.
But you're getting into a whole political kind of debate here around European history, the Enlightenment, you know, the development of postmodernity, liberalism, all that sort of thing, and certain areas of the world seeing Christianity there as having lost it, and you know, it ended when Colin Hill left.
Also, I'm very suspicious that much of that position is taken by. I mean, we are a society fascinated now by figures, right? Statistics. We're going to die of if they were. You know, we have a malignancy called statisticism or whatever. That much of the feeling the light's gone out is that the figures for institutional church have dropped sharply since the 1950s and 60s. Well, of course they have. Institutional. Did anybody take a poll of how many Roman Catholics there were in like 1650? You know, as compared to 1490, you would have seen an enormous drop in Roman Catholicism. It didn't go away. In the same way, Protestant isn't going to go away this time. But we have had institutional church is losing market share. And what nobody is paying attention to is what's coming up. I wish, I almost never lose a foot. The recovering academic in me really likes footnotes, okay? And I lost this one, and I cannot find it, but roughly. And somebody seeing the film may say, find it for me, but I can't find it. About 2 years ago, and the figures were based on 2007, I'm almost sure, in Germany, the government went through, and it's just part of a regular survey, asked the question, you know, are you Christian? And instead of asking it that way, they ask if you've been in church at least twice in the last month or something like that. And only 6% of Germans said yes, which was so that much I know it's right. Which is so shockingly low that they went back and asked the question differently. Instead of saying, have you been in church twice in the last month? Then they said, are you Christian? Yeah. And this time it was higher than it has ever been in Germany because they were all in house churches or they were in pub theology or they were worshiping, but not so that the light hasn't gone out. It's just gone where you can't read the meter. Anymore.
So it's how we define that light.
It's how you define the light, and I suspect it's statistical as much as anything. But the energy in Christianity is much higher now, I would submit, than maybe 50 years ago. I suspect.
Because we quite often ask this question when we work with, whether in youth or churches or universities, we ask them, you know, who here now knows the Our Father? And in comparison to the 90s to now, it's almost zero.
Yeah.
But we ask them, who here goes to church? Hardly any. Who here prays? bam, hands up everywhere. Who
Of course.
believes in God? Lots. I mean, there's
Absolutely.
still a high belief, understanding spirituality in God. You know, which is amazing. But my question then is, how do we help them then develop? You know, how do you
grow them into full
Yeah.
spiritual maturity?
Yeah,
I defer to the experts.
Well, I think,
I'm a sociologist just watching the thing, but I don't know how you.
yeah, I mean, like, what do we do in that situation where what has been known before is no longer known, but yet something greater is now known? How do we facilitate growth in that area?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, just understanding this idea of the paradigm shift that we're in, and it is a great transition, but also the church needs to understand where it is so it can start the processes of, you know, discipling these people or raising up these people and catching up with it. So I suppose I'm saying the light isn't out in Europe, but I do want to say the church does need to catch up a lot in order for the exact reason that you've said. There is this desire or appreciation, but the church in some way is stuck here and it needs to almost jack itself up, change the wheels, get the wheels back on and go and reach out in this new way.
In the same way, though, that a mother takes on a newborn and cares for without superimposing her personality or her values necessarily on the child. We have in the Episcopal Church USA has now a man, a priest, who's in charge of emergence and fresh expressions and all of that for Tom Brackett, who speaks of the church's position now being one of midwifery. The need to understand that something is a birthing and to facilitate that birth and make it a live birth without assuming that it's going to stay home for the rest of its life and care for you in your old age or that it's even going to live as you would live.
And as parents, you can understand it even more so.
That's right. And I love it's Tom Brackett, Father Tom Brackett, who speaks of midwifery all the time. And I find it a very fine metaphor for what we're talking about, because the church has to be able to give itself away in the same way that a woman gives herself away for the process of birth and takes that risk. And if the church doesn't, if the institutional church doesn't do that soon, this thing is going to go on independent of its mother, and that would be really unfortunate. I think that the imperative to the church is absolutely an imperative now, Jerusalem, now inherited church. Realize Antioch is happening. Send Paul and Barnabas over and then receive them back. It has to be that intercourse.
How do you pray? I mean, I have an answer for this one, but how do you go about connecting with the Creator, with the beyond, with the source, with God? How do we go get to that place where we are engaging into something that seems so inaccessible, but yet is so accessible?
Well, my answer isn't necessarily a fair one, perhaps, or a normal one, because I live Benedictine.
Okay.
So that I keep the hours, which means that every 3 hours you're going to observe an office, and automatically that gives a regimen. And I think most prayer, and outside of it, Benedictine, is not regimented. I also do a breastplate prayer. Okay. And we don't do breastplate prayer as much anymore, where you essentially write your own, and twice a day you do the breastplate of St. Patrick or St. Francis. We're familiar with them historically, but a breastplate. And then when I get up for prime in the morning, I mean, I don't get up, I have to stay in bed, but when I have the office in bed, then I spend the next hour and a half in what I suppose would be called meditation. But let me hasten to say, 50 years ago or 30 years ago with kids, you couldn't do that. That's a luxury of age.
And do you find those it's quite interesting because those are quite...
And then evening prayers, of course.
Quite systematic. You know exactly what you're doing when you do them.
Yes.
And are you finding a freedom in that?
Absolutely.
In connection?
Because what you've really got is a road in and out that you're going in and out on so many times a day that any time in between you want to go out, you go.
Yeah.
But you see, I'm using funny language, but you do go out.
Yeah. And you find a connection there with God?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And who would God, who is Jesus to you?
Oh, well.
Not a big, huge theological,
no.
Here's Greek, Latin, here's whatever.
No. All.
Okay.
Everything.
Yeah.
The whole of knowing. The whole of knowing, maybe.
Yeah.
Of feeling, of experiencing.
Yeah. And would you say that's a personal relationship?
Not in the way that evangelicals usually mean that term. I don't think sweet Jesus by and by or any of that. The Son was a presentation of Godhead. And so it's all God.
Yeah.
In a Trinitarian kind of way, it's all God. How do you like that?
And without, they're talking very personally here now. Not big, massive, broad, strokey stuff.
Yeah.
Come down to my level, is what I'm asking you guys to do.
I just basically, I take my situation with God. I take my life and I try and offer it back to Him. I try to see where I am in my day-to-day and bring it to Him. So practically how I do that, I'm more of a morning person. My wife doesn't say that I am, but I am. I get up and I just try and separate that time just to bring my day before Him. And so I use a whole wide range of materials. I might listen to some music, or I might read the Bible or something, and I take that just to stop and prepare. And then for me, I bring whatever I have from that moment into the rest of my day. So I try at lunchtime, or I try before I come home, just to bring that in to my own day. So I think it's more of a conversation rather than just a pointed, I'm just giving this mantra back. I think it's a relationship. It's that personable understanding that for me it works. But the image I find most helpful is when I pray is of Stephen when he's being stoned, and he sees that that's stoned with stones, So he's basically looking up to heaven, and he sees Jesus standing there.
That's right.
And I think for me, I always picture Jesus standing, you know what I mean, in this scene of Stephen, in his life. And so me, as wherever I am in life, I always look to Christ standing on my behalf. And so that's ultimately the gospel. So I try and do that, and sometimes I don't do it. Yeah. But overarching, if that doesn't work, I just do what Phyllis does, and that works well.
Because I would find myself like in a similar situation where I can, whether it's in liturgy or or in the mass or in a communion service, or whether it's waking up and reading or walking on the beach, whatever. I find actually the times where I've really connected with God recently have been at concerts.
I can believe that.
Like 20,000 people, 8,000 people, and I'm there in this huge crowd, and all of a sudden the music swells, and Arcade Fire or Elbow or some band, and I just find myself just knowing that there is a God, and just understanding that it resonates like this beauty within me.
Yes.
I found when I had an anxiety attack a decade ago, I was so full of fear and loneliness, but yet for some reason I couldn't have felt closer to God. Yeah. I find other times just, whether it's playing with my kids or just waking up feeling differently, that it's amazing that three different people, three different ways, but all connecting with God. I love that. That's what I love about where we're going with the church. And what I love about traditions and new churches and the emergence and all this is that it seems like collectively we can all flow into the same direction, if not always the same stream.
Yes.
I love that.
I do too. Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.